Jürgen, is that what we are trying to do?
I mentioned about the new people, since that no one passes. We could ask, come to your committee that we know. I mean, maybe probably you know many more people. I think there's potential.
Yeah, I think when
younger people somewhere that could be.
Yeah, the next draft where we ask for reviewers, we could make that pitch.
Yeah,
that makes a lot more sense than
I was
with
thinking that
maybe we could do that.
I mean, where do we get the list later on?
In the proceedings.
In the proceedings. So they transcribe it.
They scan it. Okay, sorry for the slight delay. We had some last-minute slide changes. If you downloaded the slide set, download it again. Yours are not in there yet. Yours are not in there yet. They maybe you did, but they are not in there yet. You did. Okay. Okay, welcome to not this workshop, sorry. That's the screen background on my second desktop right now. So that has turned out to be useful until you forget changing it. So welcome to the core meeting. We assume people have read the drafts. It's Friday, so I probably don't have to remind anyone of the IPR principles, but just in case I do. And we have only 90 minutes today, so we're going to rush through a number of items here. Generally, most of the items are things that are kind of almost done, but we have this last T to stroke and this last I to dot. And we need to get some decisions out of that. Of course, all decisions will be verified on the mailing list. And in the previous meeting, in the LPWAN meeting, actually an item came up that occasionally has been coming up before. So I would hope we have a little bit space at the end of the meeting before we reach 1320 to discuss how a co-op correspondent node that is talking through a number of proxies to some node that is in a very constrained environment might be informed about the timing characteristics of that correspondent. So that's something right now we don't have a mechanism for, and we may want to invent a mechanism for the LPWAN environment where we often have millibit sustained rates. So you may get a packet once every hour, and that's something that probably the other side should be informed about. Okay, so let's hope that we have time at the end. Are there any other things which should change in the agenda? So I'm trying to find slides.
In the meanwhile, can someone volunteer to help on the Etherpad? Not everybody. Huh? It works this time. Yeah, they fix it. And one Jabber scribe as well. Maybe Ari. No, doesn't work. All right. But Matthias, will you be taking the minutes as well? All right. And when Jabber works, maybe Ari, you can do the Jabber. Or not? Ah, all right. Okay. Krister, how about, no, all right. Yeah, we take notes. Can someone do the Jabber? Michael, thank you. No? Etherpad, all right. Then I'll do the Jabber part. Thank you.
This is the new one.
Okay, quick update on the CNML and a couple of open issues. So we actually ramped up 5 versions between the last IETF and this one. Key updates there. Now the base values can be repeated. That was something that was already part of the earlier draft. Then we took it away because we didn't see much value for the complexity. Then we realized actually this is a very useful thing to have. And finally, we had a long discussion on the mailing list, and we had a call with the authors and a few others. Michael was there, Christian was there. And we decided, okay, it actually makes a lot of sense for a variety of reasons, and now it's back in the draft. Also, the decision we had in the last IETF that we can now support must underline fields, and they will be ending with an underscore. That's part of the current draft. Then there was one inconsistency in the draft. A lot of the examples were using /, but that was actually not in the normative part of the allowed character set. So it was a discussion, okay, is the whole character set is relatively restricted in order to have it safe, for example, in database keys and such. But the / is highly useful, as this was already used in a lot of examples, and also in a lot of use cases of CNML, it made a lot of sense to have it in the allowed character set. So that is now also in the normative text. Usual terminology alignment, we were discussing with CNML attributes, CNML tags. So we all unified those with a new term called CNML field. A couple of new units that were proposed, they were no-brainer, and a bunch of small editorial tweaks. So then we had the work blast call. We got very good review comments from Christian and Peter. Some things that we are now adding post-work blast call is clarifying the restricted character set. What's the reason for it? A bit more justification, especially that it's used in database keys, and that's one of the reasons. And also that not all URIs can be used as names, because URIs actually allow a wider character set than the names do. So a bit more text on that. Then CNML is not only used for sensor measurements, but also used for actuation or configuring parameters. That was slightly underspecified, perhaps, and we did add more text to it in the version that is currently posted. But what Peter was asking, also a couple of examples on how would you know if a resource is accepting CNML as an actuation. So we'll add that. And also there was some discussion about mesh networks and how you should use small packets. So we'll do a bit of editorial adjustment on that. Basically saying, okay, you want to go for small packet sizes. That's why we pull off all these tricks in CNML. And this is good for example, 15.4 and LoRa networks. Then a couple of issues to be discussed. First of all, the registration policy for units. Currently, we have the INA registry for all the units that you can have in CNML. Currently, the policy is expert review or IESG approval. So the comment we got from Peter was that do we really need 2? It creates a bit of confusion what was to be added there. I guess definitely want to have the expert review, want to have it low overhead as to register new things. But usually the IESG approval is a good escape hatch if something goes funny with the expert review. So that's what we have currently, but do we want to clarify that?
Carsten Baumann without J-Head. Generally, we have had good experience with keeping several doors open here, and I don't think it actually will confuse anyone. So I think it's a good idea to do this kind of policy, even if it may seem a little bit duplicate or something like that.
Alexei Malakov, this has caused some confusion in other registries in the past sometimes. One thing I would say is that expert review, because experts are assigned by ISG, ISG is always in the appeal path. So if you're not very happy with the expert, you can always go to ISG and do it there anyway. And if there is ISG approval as a choice, sometimes people might want to bypass the process and submit it directly to ISG, at which point it's like, well, we would rather ask the expert anyway. So not a strong preference, but I suggest you just do expert review and point out that, you know, appeals can be handled in the usual way.
Okay, any more views on that? So, as chair would decide here, Jaime?
Well, let's check on the mailing list first, right? Or
Okay, we'll take one more round of the mailing list on this, but so I guess there are arguments both ways, but no one feeling very strong either way.
Yeah. I'll read it as well.
Okay, let's move on. Links extension. So this was something that was mentioned in the working group last call when we initiated it, that we think majority of the draft is very, very mature and stable, but there's one piece, this link extension, that is currently in the appendix that maybe was not at the same level of maturity as the rest of the document. And maybe it's better that we take it as a separate document, spend some time looking into it properly, see how we want to do it. The main reason for having it here was that it would get the seaport tag, and you could actually save 1 byte, but maybe links in general are quite long, so saving 1 byte per link maybe is not worth the effort of doing it in a, let's say, too expedited way with this draft. So what we would suggest here that we take the links extension as a separate document and just start it right away and make sure we get it right. I see people nodding, Dave giving thumbs up, Michael nodding. No one objecting, so okay, let's do that. We'll remove the links extension from here and start a new document. And then 2 more issues. One that was actually discovered just today when we're discussing the restricted character set in the names. Currently, the names don't allow semicolon. And there are some URI schemes, for example, NI, that uses semicolon as the separator between the hash of something and the algorithm that the hash was used to generate. So it could be useful to be able to use that kind of URIs or other URI schemes that use semicolon as a SNML name. Now, the key question here is semicolon a safe character? And safe in a sense that you would be dumping it safely to various database keys, for example. So that's the reason why, for example, we don't allow backslash, because backslash has very special meaning in a lot of these places, and you don't want to be escaping and doing too many safeguards on those. So is semicolon a safe character in that sense? Like, would you dump it in your databases and such without worrying too much? Or would you have to check every single time, do something special treatment for that? Kerry.
I'm just going to have a comment on alt after I hear about it, possibly.
Well, sure, you can stay in the line for. Let's finish this point, because that's the last point we have, so we can take it then.
So I haven't read this draft in a while. I need to go back and reread it. But I'm taking flight lessons, right? And altitude is actually described in 2 ways for pilots. One is above MSL, which is the mean sea level. The other is above ground level. So I guess my advice here would be to have some sort of a reference for your altitude definition.
Yeah, I guess that's the discussion. The coordinates are much more complicated than we think. And right now we have very basic lat-long model for coordinates. I'm thinking we need a separate SNML document just for coordinates eventually to get like to the core of it. There's going to be like relative coordinates and absolute and different systems, etc. So maybe that would be part of that document.
Christian Holmer, I don't know anything about this, but just a generic comment, having worked with a number of different URI schemes, etc., is that this semicolon normally does have a special meaning. So
in URI schemes, yes. Now the worry is more about databases, big data as such, where you would use it as a key. So definitely in URI schemes, it has a special meaning.
Okay.
But that should not be an issue, because it's more like if you would use this on your big data database and such systems, if there is an issue.
Yeah, if we could, Carsten, if we could sort characters into different temperatures, the semicolon is probably about 80 degrees Celsius, because it will hurt touching them, but probably the damage will not be very big. So semicolon is a dangerous character if you start feeding these things to the shell, to the Unix shell or environments like that. So what we might want to discuss is the likelihood of people putting out SNML names unprotected into Unix shell commands. I think anybody who does that, no further comment. Now on the alt thing, one confusion that we consistently have is the confusion between units and quantities. So for instance, if you have a pressure, you might have an absolute pressure, or you might have a relative pressure compared to the environmental pressure. And traditional engineers who use kitchen units have made up different unit names for this. So there is something called PSI gauge and PSI absolute and so on. But that's not the way SI units work. In SI, you actually have units and then you have quantities. And quantities, those define what you're actually measuring, and the unit is only telling you what unit is being used for doing that measuring. So one mistake we may have made in doing SNML is not having a quantity field. So you don't know, when something is there that is expressed in meters, you don't know whether it's the height of the operator, or the size of the operator, or the size of their left arm, or the altitude in pressure altitude, or in altitude compared to WGS 80 and so on. I mean, this is all contextual information you also need. Knowing that it's in meters, or even knowing that it's in altitude, is not sufficient. Mm-hmm. So to get real semantic interpretability, you need more information anyway. So I think we are better off for this units registry, which currently actually mostly contains units plus some backwards compatibility gunk. We should stick with the unit, and the unit for altitude is usually meters. So I think we are done with that one. But we may want to think about the other aspect about, I mean, if I have 3 sensor readings which are all in meters or all in Kelvin or whatever, I need to know what they mean. And okay, one is the outside temperature, one is the inside temperature, and I need to label them in some way to get that semantic information across. So I think that's a separate item, and we should work on it separately.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we already, a few IETFs ago, we decided to have the M tag for metadata or something along those lines for expressing more metadata per record. So that's something what we need to be working on. And maybe the other registry is also part of that.
Dave Taylor, I really like Karsten's suggestion, and it occurs to me that by that definition, Celsius and Kelvin is the same units, so you don't need 2 different unit values.
Mm-hmm.
Gunk.
Bill Silverajan. I'm bringing the discussion back to the first point about the semicolon. Did you explore alternatives to semicolons?
Not really, because I mean the semicolon was part of, for example, the NI URI specification. So I mean, either you use as such or you do something else, and then if you do something else, yeah, you can change with a colon. But if you want to avoid that kind of tweaks and tricks, that was the reason. Okay, maybe we want to add that.
Okay, and a related question was that, do you have any reserved keywords that should not be used in the character set?
The rest. So the stuff that is not allowed, I mean, everything else except what is explicitly defined allowed is not allowed.
Okay.
So yes, we could be later defining new ones but then you have to have the usual challenges of extensions.
I mean, my point was that it might make sense to put in the character set, but I believe that the usage should be a lot more than just one URI format, like me.
Yeah. I mean, this is not only for NI. I mean, NI was as an example that has the semicolon, because that was what Peter and Andre pointed out, that, for example, NI URIs don't work. That was like, an NI URI seemed pretty useful for able to do the hash-based IDs.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, that seems like an easy thing to fix. Then there was the tag URIs, which have the @ sign. That could be going a bit more risky territory.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm, but of course we have to check the semicolon also on the list, and especially with Colin, because Colin couldn't come here, and Colin has been very strict on what kind of characters should we have there, because he has most experience on the database side. So let's confirm that on the list. But what I heard so far, no one has been objecting that, so it seems like a good idea. Objecting adding semicolon. So adding semicolon seems okay, but let's check it on the list. And regarding the alt, I guess we will not, what I heard now, we would not add it here, but we will do the separate document which explores the whole idea of coordinates, etc. in more detail. Separate document, the alt part, because yeah, we already have the meter, which is for our current purpose, I guess, close enough, and then we'll do the proper job in a separate document.
One question. Have you thought about using UCUM units for?
We are.
And in the separate document, apart from the current authors, would you get expertise from other organizations that maybe have more
Yes, I mean,
competence on that?
definitely, like in W3C, there's one group looking into this stuff. So that would be, let's say, prerequisite for that. I wouldn't have all the competence to do that, so definitely would be needed. Okay, that was all.
Yeah, so I think the authors, one of which I am, will after answering these questions, will consider the working group last call documents processed, and then it's up to the remaining chair.
Yeah, same basically. Like we will continue on the middle list, and let's see how, if we can finish it. I mean, the target would be Singapore, perhaps. Earlier even. All right.
I was hoping you were going to push the button. But
Already for working group last call.
no, it just finished working group last call.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, so those were the comments we got, and this is how we're gonna address them. So we're gonna consider it concluded. Right. Excellent. And yes, we will do an update ASAP and be done with it by Singapore. Yeah, definitely.
The reason we are discussing this today is that it finished on Wednesday, right? Thursday? No. Thursday. Friday? Oh, it finishes today. So you still have time to put in comments.
I mean, having ISU by Singapore and being done by then.
Yes.
Dave Taylor, that sounds good, although there was actually an implied question in my comment, which I just realized. Right now, the document as is does list Celsius and Kelvin as two separate unit values. If we think we're going to go in the direction that Karsten is saying, you may want to remove one of those.
Right. So there are several units in the table which are marked with a star, which means this is not really what you should be using, but we know that this is widely being used. And temperature is one of these weird cases where people somehow are emotionally attached to the unit of Celsius, which I don't understand, but they don't. No, that's a bug. That's a bug. That's a bug. That's a bug. Okay, so there are some 5 units in there that really don't belong there because they are not SI units. But even the people who wrote ISO 80,000 recognize Celsius as a unit that is in such a wide use that they cannot really put it into an appendix, but it's actually an SI recognized unit, even though it's really weird because you really only have to subtract 273.15 and then you are there. So whatever.
So the expression was, you actually think about that table before you push the button. It sounds like,
Yeah.
yes, you're gonna do something about the table before you push the button. At least put in a star. If nothing
Yeah.
else.
Let's have a quick meeting.
Yes.
Yeah, good, very good. Okay, so I think we are done with that item. What was that? Okay, so quickly jump through the old slide. So the next item on the agenda is the resource directory. And we are going to do this in 2.5 steps. So we now have 2 drafts. So let's talk about 2 drafts, and we'll start with the first one. I think Michael wants to present that. Then I have my half step, and then we go to the other draft.
So in the interim, since Chicago, I think even maybe before Chicago, we've added a new editor to the draft, Christian Amzus, to take the role of dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and spending the time necessary to make it a good product and get it finished. And we've been having regular teleconferences about once a month or sometimes a little more frequently to discuss issues and resolve things. And one of the things that we realized was that there was a lot of ambiguity about what different things meant in resource directories. So one of the things that Peter created an entity relationship diagram to represent what RD is, and we're planning on we use that as a good tool to discuss things and to make choices. We improved some of the text and addressed a lot of comments that we got, fixed some things up, made some decisions on these remaining issues, and clarified through the ER diagram, what the D domain parameter really means, which was one of the questions we kept getting. So there's also talk about resource directory as sort of a shadow of well-known core. So the ER model includes well-known core. This is what well-known core has. Basically, I don't pay too much attention to thing because that's really just any item. I don't know what to call it, a device or an endpoint. It's not an endpoint, a node, whatever. It's a node on the network. It's a thing that has a scheme authority and port, and it has a well-known core with links in it. Resource directory has the same basic pieces in it, but it has a number of shadows of these. These are registrations, and the registrations have additional parameters on them. They contain links, and also resource directory can have groups, and groups are associated with multicast address, and groups are composed of registrations. So you can put a number of these registrations, which is the shadow of the stuff that comes from one thing, into a group, and then talk to them through a multicast address. So this is for things like putting a bunch of lights together in a room and actuating them all together. Registration parameters, each one has a location that's assigned when it's registered that you can use to reference that information, an endpoint name, an endpoint type, a lifetime, and domain. So domain is really just a registration attribute that gets used in a number of different ways, and we don't put a lot of constraints on it about what it means.
Dave Taylor, I'm not responding to what you said, but since you paused because I gave you a weird look, it's because I realized you have a terminology error on the slide, which may be in the document, which is the port is part of the authority component, not something that comes.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, good point. I was confused. That's my mistake. Okay, thanks. We'll fix that. I'm used to saying scheme authority port, so I guess I should get used to not saying that. Scheme authority is really the way to say that. Okay, good.
Or scheme host port.
For some authorities, you have a host and a port.
Host and port. So scheme, host and port is, yeah, okay, so that's that. Okay, good, thanks.
Origin.
Or, which constitutes a web origin or an internet origin, yes. Okay, so next steps, we're going to make sure the specification is consistent with the model, which, you know, is mostly that way now, but let's make sure we're not saying anything that's different from what our abstract model is. We'll put a representation of the model in the document, some fun ASCII art. Simplify the section about finding an RD. That's the remaining comment we get, is this about discovery of an RD or things in an RD? So finding an RD needs to, oops.
Let me speak to that.
Okay, sorry. Great. So there's some more stuff about, oops, how did that happen?
Go back to your part and I do the other slide.
Oh, okay, so, so someone's been working more on that. That's great. Okay, so how to find an RD is, we need to work on that. There's a few more issues to clean up, like we want to make sure we have all of our URI templates expressed correctly and this sort of thing. And then we're hoping to do working group last call over the mailing list and have that in process before Singapore. Do you want to go back to the thing you just showed?
Yeah, if there is no other comment on the other items on your slide, then let me quickly talk about this thing here. So we have discussed about ways node that comes up and wants to make itself known in the resource directory, how that finds its resource directories. So we have that problem in a million other places in the IETF where things come up and have to find the entity that provides a specific service for them. And typically the device that comes up can be specifically configured for something. And often we also try to define what happens if the device is not specifically configured. So you just bought it at Walmart and take it out of the bubble wrap and try to switch it on. Now, about 26 years ago, a working group was started called DHC, which provided a way to have the network provide information to devices that come up on that network. Now, whether that is applicable or not is dependent on your security model, so that's a complicated thing, not for the resource directory to solve. But the assumption is that it actually does make sense to also say what should happen if the network is trying to provide information for the device where to find a resource directory. And then the third branch is one where the device comes up, doesn't find anything in its own configuration that would help it, nor finds anything at the network configuration level. And the question is, what should the device do? Well, one answer to that might be keep silent, pretend it doesn't exist or something like that. Now, so this is really the complexity of the section right now. We have three different branches we have to address, and this branching is not written down. It's in the head of the person reading that. So let's talk about this first branch. The device is specifically configured. It might be configured with an IP address. It might be configured with a DNS name plus an RR type to use with that DNS name. So it needs to know whether it's looking up the A or quad A record, or maybe looks up the service record. We don't know that. It might use MDNS to find an RD service in MDNS, so that it then uses to do a resource directory registration, which probably, as Kerry will say in a moment, will then be copied over back to the MDNS. Or it might be using another discovery mechanism, for instance, UPnP. So these are kinds of situations in the case the device is specifically configured to use some mechanism that is not default. And the second case is the device is not specifically configured. So this is the case that is described in the document. So the others would be mentioned, but this is really described in the document. That's why it's yellow on this slide. And here we really want to limit the choices because we have gotten a lot of feedback that we are offering too many choices. And it looks like we are not going to solve the Slack versus DHCP war today. So let's just put both in. I note that the DHCP option doesn't exist. So in practice, this might for a while be an easy choice, but until someone defines that DHCP option. And the third branch then, well, we probably still have to write up something there, but it can only be a suggestion. I don't think we want to actually define a default behavior here. And right now, two sources we identify is any RDNSS information in a Slack or ABRO information that we find in a 6LoWPAN-NG document. Both point to places that are rather likely to actually support some form of resource directory functionality. So a device that finds itself out there in the desert might want to try those. So these are also called out explicitly, but more in the sense of being a list of suggestions. So this is my proposal for how we structure the section. We identify the branches, and we provide cases for the case that the device is not specifically configured, and the case where the device is specifically configured, of course, is covered by that specific configuration. Stuart.
Stuart Cheshire, Apple. I'm a bit puzzled with how the options are even framed here. That branch 1 is devices specifically configured. Now I understand a specific IP address, unless it's an Anycast address, is a specific configuration. The second option is use MDNS. Well, one terminology nitpick, it would be better to say DNS service discovery, because MDNS is just one way of doing service discovery.
Yeah, I was specifically talking about MDNS. I know the difference.
Okay, well, I would broaden it. If you're on a mesh network that doesn't support MDNS, you would still use DNS service discovery in its broadest sense.
How? What should I write there? The device just comes up.
The words you would use was use DNSSD, are the words you would use.
But
and
it's
then you
not
reference
defined
RFC
how to use
67,
DNSSD
63.
over 6LoWPAN or something like that. So it's not useful guidance.
People behind me are saying, yes, it is.
Oh,
so
I'm
let's not rat hole on
willing to
that. But it seems that the way this is split seems very odd to me, because on your, if you've got a Mac, you go into printer settings and hit plus, and you will see terminal room printer or with AirPrint on your iPhone, and your Mac was not specifically configured with the IETF terminal room printer before you came here. You brought it here and it discovered it. So that really ought to be listed. And your third choice, use other service discovery mechanism such as UPnP. I assume by UPnP you mean SSDP, not like UPnP in its entirety.
But UPnP defines those mechanisms, yes.
Yeah, UPnP is like saying use IEEE. It's a very broad term.
Yes.
But for you mean one specific of the hundreds.
Should
of
I write
UPnP
use
protocols.
Apple for the MDNS?
No, I think you mean use SSDP. But those, I would put those under the not specifically configured, because that is what you use when you come into an environment and you know nothing, and you ask the environment, help, tell me something. So that seems like an odd choice to call those the specifically configured ones.
Yeah.
And Dave has some other comments, so I'll let him say them.
So to actually use something like MDNS, I have to become active and use it. And
you keep saying MDNS, and I keep saying it's not MDNS. When you're here at the IETF meeting discovering the IETF terminal room printer, and you're not in the terminal room on that network, you're not using multicast DNS. You're using wide area DNS service discovery. And on a mesh network like 15.4, that's what you would use, not multicast.
Dave.
So yeah, Dave Sealer. I actually agree with everything that Stuart said this time. I often do. I'm saying this time too. Yeah. If you have a DNS server, so I'm just going to echo Stuart's point why we were saying yes, it is. If you have a DNS server, even over a 15.4 network, you're just doing DNSSD over DNS instead of over MDNS, and so that's why it's not just MDNS. So part of Stuart's point was just if you can discover a DNS server across your 15.4 network, DNSSD is defined already, and it works fine.
Yes.
And so that's why I'm saying broaden MDNS to just DNS-DSD, because there's two ways, whether you do it multicast or whether you do it unicast, or just two different ways of doing DNS-SD. So I think that's why we were saying yes, it is when Stuart was talking. What I got up here to talk about was the part that's highlighted. Not that there's anything wrong with the part that's highlighted, but because it's more complicated than that. Sort of welcome to the internet area. So what I got up here to say is it's a lot like getting your DNS server address. So you can take one of two approaches, right? You can either get your RD address the same way as you got your DNS server address, okay, which is one sort of branch that much of the internet area often goes down. Another branch is the one that Stuart is talking about, which is you use the DNS server address to get the other addresses, okay? And so that's the DNS-SD approach, right? And so at a high level, what you're trying to accomplish in the highlighted branch of the 2A1 and 2A2 is to say, well, I think I kind of want to get the RD address the same way as I got the DNS server address, okay? And if you said that as the principle, that's actually more understandable to internet area people. And I say that because these are not just the only two things that internet area people are talking about. So for example, and I don't want to derail the meeting, I'm just giving you why it's more complicated than this, and limiting the choices is something that's more of an internet area discussion, because there's discussion about something called provisioning domains, and I don't want to have to define it here, but my point is, even this week in the 6-man group, there was discussions about another way of getting things that is on a per provisioning domain basis, because you might want to have a different answer because your router is multi-home to two different networks, each of which has a different answer, and so it can't just put it in the RA because that's ambiguous or something, right? And so they're defining these other ways, and whether that's doing an HTTP request and getting back in a JSON blob or whatever it is, right? And so if you say the principle is that you get this the same way as you get the DNS server address, and that tells anybody that's defining a new mechanism that this is just one of the things that has to come back in that blob, right? And so that's one branch. Either that, or you take the approach that says you just use DNS to resolve it, and that's your branch one, yes. Okay, as Stuart was talking about, which is you use DNS-SD. So that's how I would phrase it in principle. And then whether you define a DHCP option or something is just, if people want to use that, then that's a way of following the principle. So that's what I got.
Yeah, so the point here that we're trying to avoid is to make DNS a requirement for using resource directory.
Okay, well, a lot of what I wanted to say was just told by Dave, but I did some work with service location protocol many years ago, and it was useful to make a distinction between service discovery and service lookups. So their service discovery meant that there was an active process already available in the network, and your device goes there and it's configured, just listening for advertisements. And you can solicit. And service lookups are specifically when you actually have to configure the device to do something. So that's one thing, and I think that would help a lot to separate how to find the resource directory. The second thing that I wanted to say was that let's be consistent. How you find a resource discovery should be the same way as how you do your resolution to find your DNS servers and so on. But just out of experience, I just wanted to say that especially for energy constrained devices, multicast traffic is a big power drain. And we realized that when we did some experiments and look at power consumption patterns. So for a simple device that is trying to use just CoAP to communicate, and that has listened to MDNS, the amount of traffic on MDNS was so heavy that it was actually consuming more power than it was using for CoAP communication. So I think that needs to be taken into account when you're talking about MDNS.
Dave, Robin, I also want to pick apart how these branches are broken up a little bit here. It seems to be branch one, bullet one is consistent. In other words, I know, for some reason, I know a DNS name or an IP address of my server, and I just go ask for it. I've been configured to do that. The second bullets, though, I don't think follow under specifically configured, because they really fall under branch two. Because if I'm using it says use MDNS or DNS-SD, as was pointed out, to find a service, not a particular name of a server. So if I'm just saying find a service, I'm doing that either through UPnP, the service discovery there, or MDNS or DNS-SD, anything. I'm still need to know what I'm asking for a service name. And my point for coming to the mic is that's exactly the same as looking for a DHCP option with a particular name. I don't see those as being any different. I have to, branch 2 is not, I'm completely clueless, I don't know what to do. If you, it's lying there in your DHCP message with an option name or a number. But if I don't know to look for it, then I still am helpless.
That's why we want to have it in the spec. To
Yes,
say,
no, I understand.
Do look for
Do look for
RDAO,
this
do look for
option.
the DHCP
Right,
option. Once
yes.
it's-
And so I'm saying the second 2 bullet points of looking for something are part of branch 2. You have to know what you're looking for. It's either a service name or an option number or whatever. You still are that level of configuration, but not a location configuration, not a specific server in mind.
Hi, this is Hannes. So I think, Carsten, you started this presentation because you were wondering of what should actually be done in the RD document, I guess. And it seems that the int area has standardized so many different mechanisms that it would be pretty much impossible to get any form of interoperability here. So I'm wondering whether the most obvious approach is to have the RD document just be punt on that issue, be silent on it, and maybe work on a separate document that lays out the different options, whatever the classification is, because there are many options, and then presumably some other organizations that will then pick a subset, but or select 1 or 2 their preferred mechanism, and there will just be, it would just be in practice difficult to have devices working with each other and finding the stuff, because there would be like too many choices. Is that so where you're heading, or are you?
That's not what I would suggest. I would suggest to deliver resource discovery with batteries included. And
You want to have the resource server discovery in the RD document itself?
Yes. That is what I would suggest. So people who implement a resource directory on the client side have a default way to actually find one.
But okay, it seems difficult to come up with a default way, right? It sounds like from this list and from the discussion, it sounds like there are lots of options and different preferences.
Yes, and I would like us to decide on one.
Ambitious?
Yes, that's my nature.
Stuart Cheshire again. I find the whole discussion very strange because it seems like you're really bending over backwards to avoid using the solution that already exists. You have an entity on the network called the resource directory. You talk to it by exchanging packets. It's a service. You want to discover it. We've been through this process. We have had lots of debates. We've published RFCs. We have code running on Apple products, Android. Windows 10 now has its own native APIs for DNS service discovery. And you are really going through contortions to find out reasons to not use the existing solution. And I do not understand any of those arguments.
Yeah, I agree that for Windows 10, it's probably actually a good idea to always include
It's also on
this
Raspberry Pi,
configuration.
Arduino, it's on microchip development kits. It's like having become the ubiquitous way of doing service discovery, and you have a service you want to discover. It's like how you could possibly fail to see the solution right in front of you is absolutely bizarre.
Well, I don't fail to see it. I just don't want to use it.
Why you have such a strong objection to using the solution right in front of you? Okay, so you see it and still refuse to use it. It's even more bizarre.
Alexander Pro here. Just a question. I mean, we're talking a lot about like constraintness of devices, but there are networks that are constrained, and there are places that we don't want to run multicast, and that things don't work like that. So, I mean, maybe this is not the only question, but it's like I just don't want to get over. Okay, microcontroller, this and this. There are the networks already that we don't want to.
I feel like I should be a school teacher with a ruler in my hand and rap everybody's knuckles when they say the word multicast. There are 2 RFCs. 6762 defines multicast DNS. 6763, which was very deliberately and intentionally a separate RFC, defines service discovery, which does not have to use multicast. And I just gave the example. here at the IETF meeting, go into printer setup and set up a printer, you are not using multicast. So anytime somebody uses the argument about multicast, they're talking about the wrong RFC.
So Eric, not Mark. So maybe there's some different assumptions from different people in the room what it means to work with constrained devices and constrained networks. I know what a Raspberry Pi is. I call those things IoT supercomputers because 25 years ago they were supercomputers. They have a gig of RAM, right? It's very different to think about that. And then we have the millipackets per second networks that Karsten coined. I think that's where I heard the term, but the fact that people are building networks that can deliver 13-byte frames a few times a day is very different than the environment that a Raspberry Pi exhibits. So I think that there's a disconnect when you talk about constrained devices here. And I think that that's why there's some tension here saying, do we have to have 17 different ways of doing this stuff that needs to pull in service discovery mechanisms that might trigger the DNS, include DHCP, and do all of these things? The fact that they fit on a Raspberry Pi is irrelevant.
Well, if that's the constraint, then I think the constraint ought to be written down about what is the code space, what is the packet size, what is the processing. I gave an example earlier this week from one of our developer workshops we had at Apple 15 years ago. The product is still on the market. It's called a Site Player Telnet. It's a neat little box that you can plug into things with serial ports, and it lets you telnet to them over the network. That device 15 years ago had 16K of flash memory. 9K of that was the HTML source for its web-based UI, and in the remaining 7K, the guy had all the software for Ethernet driver, serial port driver, web UI, DHCP client, and
yeah, I think
that is an important point, but I don't think it's relevant to service discovery. My point is he had 700 bytes of free code space and was able to implement DNS service discovery in 700 bytes. So if our threshold is whatever this is implementation for this must use less than 700 bytes. Let's actually write that down as a filter that's applied uniformly to all the proposals, that it must be less than 700 bytes of code space.
Yeah, I think, yes. 70 to 28. Table 1. So basically, I think that there is a non-negligible group of people who would want to avoid the co-op ecosystem to become dependent on DNS. And I happen to be a member of that group. And I don't think we want to make co-op independent of IP. I believe that relying on neighbor discovery, or for those people who like it, DHCP, is the right way to solve this bootstrapping problem. And from then on, we know how to operate. And we also know how to interface with DNSSD and carriers next.
What's the conclusion?
No conclusion yet.
Continue discussion.
Take it to the list. I mean, this is not something we can decide today.
I guess I'll make a microphone point to the last slide, and that is that I'm guessing that the resource directory is going to be fairly resourceful. If you go out and buy a printer today, you find that that printer supports a variety of discovery schemes, a variety of printing protocols, and so forth. So I think the optionality is from the standpoint of the clients. They don't necessarily need to, we don't need to necessarily specify a method for the clients to find the RD, but the RD should be fairly resourceful and be able to support a variety of discovery methods. Okay, I sort of wish that I had come before the DNSSD debate. I have to feel like I have to sort of justify now why we're doing this. As an historical note, when Core was first chartered, discovery, service or resource or otherwise, was not in the charter. And one of the items that we were responsible for was explaining how we would interface with, say, existing discovery mechanisms like DNSSD. That was in the original charter. I worked a lot with Peter Vanderstock at the outset, explaining how we might use DNSSD to do resource discovery or service discovery more properly in this environment. this work here on mapping was sort of a result of that, because ultimately Core came up with a way of doing discovery using COAP, and as a further efficiency, the resource directory was posited as a way of collecting all that information in one place and eliminating the need to do multicast for discovery. And so our fallback at that point was to at least say, well, let's at least describe how to translate between one naming system and the other. So the motivation is really about, for example, supporting heterogeneous environments where, because we have these things called cross proxies, we potentially enable HTTP clients to talk to COAP servers, and those might more naturally use a DNSSD discovery mechanism. I think that what I'm going to try to do is make the case that there are certain types of resources, namely RESTful API entry points, that are virtually indistinguishable from what DNSSD calls a service. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, is mapping at that level of granularity. It really doesn't make sense to map every single resource in the resource directory into DNSSD, but at least at the level of what are variously called function sets or command classes or objects, which are defined by SDOs that have, sort of a collection of, functionality. It all belongs in one unit. The link that gives you the entry point into there is probably the proper granularity to map between RD and into DNSSD. So one of the reasons that, okay, back to historical note, we worked with Zach Shelby on the mapping. It was decided several years ago that we would roll this into the RD draft, but as we're trying to mature the RD draft, a couple things happened. First, nobody could really remember the context in which this stuff was done in the first place, so I'm here to sort of re-socialize it. Secondly, we felt that the resource directory draft would get to the finish line faster if we remove this and put it back into an individual draft. It was it was originally an individual submission, but because it was in the RD, which was a working group document, and then pulled out, this draft has basically gone to working group draft immediately. So I just want to describe briefly DNS-based service discovery for anybody who might be unfamiliar with it. What it really is a conventional use of existing DNS infrastructure, namely the resource records and the protocol elements. So we have things like hosts, which could be described as A or quad A records. A pointer record is actually used to do a lookup on a service type. So essentially you're looking for a class. It's a way of discovering a class of things like printers. What you get back in return is a set of instances, which then can be used to name SRV and text records, which always come in pairs. The SRV is used to give you the host and port. So, you're not bound to a well-known port. The original use of SRV was to basically get us out of the tyranny of well-known ports. And then text records can contain arbitrary key value pairs that could give you attributes on that resource or on that service. So as I said earlier, this proposal essentially equates one type of resource in particular, which is a RESTful API entry point, with the concept of service. So in terms of mapping, let me just pop forward here. The proposal talks about some new link target attributes and requires that some existing definitions be there. I'm not sure we have a term for exporting these things is optional, but if you do export them, then you have to do it in a certain way. Certain things will be mandatory if you decide that you want to export, your resource into the DNSSD. So EXP is a target attribute that's kind of a hint that can drive an automated mapping tool to say, I want this API entry point to be exported to DNS, or potentially we could define this to be EXP equals, and then actually define the other name system that we wish to map into. For now, it's just a Boolean, and DNSSD is the default. Instance is essentially a unique identifier within the context of a domain in which this thing will be registered that allows you to distinguish this one from all the others. In DNSSD, the instance name is intended to be human readable, so it's basically in web normal UTF-8 format. We will require you to specify your resource type. There's an opportunity, I think, here to go back and look at the RT registry, which we essentially have expert control over. And right now, I think it's a structured namespace. I think we have the opportunity to make it a federated namespace if we choose to do so, which would help to, keep different application definitions separate. And then finally, IF is a semantic tag or a link to the interface description. The core link RFC basically sort of anticipated this might be, for example, a link off to a schema or something like that, or a waddle. So here's a quick example. The color codes are sort of shown there to show what gets mapped to what. So let's say you formulate a query. We're sort of thinking that these queries would be directed at resource directories themselves, rather than multicast. But just bear with me here. You basically do a lookup on things that have the EXP attribute set. And here's an example of getting back something, which is, it's got a path there in red. It's got a context type. The resource type is defined by the OCF in this case. If we go along with this federated namespace idea, the first part of that OIC becomes the resource type or the service type that we register. Down below, we see the resulting resource records. We have to basically create a host name if one doesn't already exist. We register this thing as being of type OIC, and everything under OIC is actually owned by that SDO. So it's the subtype is the temperature sensor, and down below, everything that's left over, such as the path and the interface definition, basically go into the text record as key value pairs. So that's the proposal. But we presented this in DNSSD on Wednesday, and I think, although the draft is here, I think it would be important to have input from both working groups. So any questions, comments? Hey, Tim.
Hey, Kerry. Thanks. Tim Carey, Nokia. I do have two comments, really. One is, because we've had some of this problems before in some other SDOs and trying to map things, if you will, to the instance numbers and stuff. And so a lot of it was particularly like certain tools and stuff like that. But in the standard, have you made sure that the formatting, you got OIC.R. temperature sensor actually turns into an appropriate, in terms of the syntax, an appropriate instance ID, where you have, because you got, special characters and that all translates through. I think that's something to make sure that you look at as we go through this, to make sure that you can get it into the appropriate syntax for an instance piece.
I just want to back up here. Again, I mentioned that,
or service type in this case.
Yeah, it's not required that you export your APIs, but if you do, then the values of these attributes have to be in a form. The burden is on the client to basically put these in a form that can be directly exported into DNSSD. So in terms of instance names, for example, what DNSSD accepts is actually pretty wide. Periods, for example, are totally permissible. So one other thing to point out.
Yeah, but starting something with a period, I think, my only point is that if there are some restrictions that you have on these DNSD elements, right, I think we ought to at least compare those to those elements that we want to translate from. As I was saying, because we ran into a couple of gotchas when we were doing some implementations.
I think the point I'm trying to make is that what DNSSD will accept as an instance name is fairly broad. So if an organization wants to say, well, we require our identifiers to be like this, then I think there might be a lot of flexibility there as to what you can import into
Sure,
DNSSD.
and then we also ran into some sizing, right? You know, because it's like 16 or something like that, right?
63 bytes.
One of those we ran into trouble with. My point is that as you go across that, it may be very well just guidance, you know, of some mapping guidance, you know, say, watch out here, watch out there.
We are about 15 minutes over schedule, so if we could keep this brief.
Yes, Stuart Cheshire, I'll just briefly answer that question. For instance names, the character set is completely unrestricted. There are no reserved characters. The way characters are encoded and mapped is defined rigorously, so there are no dangerous characters. You can't use any valid Unicode character can be used. There is a length limit of 63 octets of normalization form KC UTF-8 text. That gives you the length limit, and that is for the user visible instance names, which are intentionally rich text, uppercase, lowercase, spaces, punctuation, whatever you would write in normal human communication. The service types are machine readable information. They are never normally seen by humans unless you're looking in Wireshark, and they don't need to be as expressive. For coding convenience, they're limited to 15 characters of letters, digits, and hyphens. So those are the two character set constraints to be aware of.
I think one thing that we do need to take to the list is this notion of potentially having a federated namespace. Just maybe a happy accident that the RT directory already has sort of these pre-labels like OIC and CORE and that sort of thing. But an important point is that the service type does have to be registered with IANA. So one thing that a federated namespace would afford is that an organization would only have to go and register this label, and then they would own everything under that label. DNSSD only affords us really two dimensions of search capability or filtering capability, the type and the subtype. Dave.
Dave Taylor, I just wanted to comment on a different topic, which is the underscore UDP and its relationship with the presentation that I gave. I think in order to talk about this, right now it's just draft 00, right? So I'm saying future work, please talk about how you'd cover each of the different URI schemes that's in there. You know, it's how you distinguish between COAP and COAP-S, and how you would handle the COAP plus WS schemes, for which service names are not legal. So you need to cover those in order to have a complete solution. So good work so far, keep it up. I look forward to draft 01, which covers a more complete solution. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Very short, Bill Silverajan. I hope you can find some way to map the lifetime values when you register to the resource directory with the TTL of the resource records.
Well, DNS by default has a TTL. So, I mean, are you saying you would prefer?
SRV records have TTLs and priorities and weights. So I just didn't see that in the example. So that's why I just mentioned that. Because if your lifetime is expired in the RD, then you need to know what to do with it.
So you're saying that's something that you potentially would like to be signaled with a target attribute?
Potentially, but there's a default TTL, and but it's not a default value in the resource directory. You can adjust that value. So.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so I think what Dave said, this is a good start and needs a little bit of work, but it's not exactly rocket science maybe either. So let's try to go through a few more examples and make sure all these examples work right, and get this done. Next item, Michael pops up. And if you could do this in -8 minutes, I would be -8, yes.
This draft seems to be going along pretty well. We've made no substantial changes to what it does since working group adoption. It's mostly been about clarifying things. At one point, we put some stuff in that we thought was useful, but we took it back out. We're basically, the philosophy is keep the protocol simple. We're not trying to do queuing, and we're just doing simple notification. We have ways to enhance it later with other functionality we'll touch on here, but you can go find out more offline. We've addressed a substantial set of comments that are going to be feeding into the next update. There's a really, really good set of comments from Jim Schad. And for reliable notification, well, basically what we're looking at for the more involved protocol where people want, some notion of quality of service and queuing and some other things, we're looking at a thing, subscriber managed queues, basically. So you can subscribe and create a queue. And I've got a little write-up in the GitHub issues if you want to know more about what the proposal looks like for that. But that would be done as a separate draft to add on to this. We think this draft is best if it just describes the simple notification system. So the roadmap, we're going to finish, addressing all the outstanding comments in the next draft. So all the ones that we've already addressed, and then any more that we receive. There are a few substantial decisions that would impact things a little bit in terms of like, I guess, sort of corner cases, special cases of what happens when you do this. And this isn't just describing what happens when you do something that's not been expected or not been accounted for. We'll rework the normative language. There was a suggestion that we think about how you would test one and evaluate the normative language based on having to write test cases, and that's an excellent suggestion. I've learned that in my work in other SDOs, that's a really good way to go about it, so we'll do that. We need to put some guidance in the security considerations. That's been suggested for all drafts, and this can be beefed up a little bit. And so we'll work with the OS CoAP profile for PubSub and talk a little bit more about what we mean by access control, even though there's no really good access control policy, ACL kind of thing that we know of that's kind of standardized. And this isn't the place to do it, but maybe that's some future work. And we want to target the working group last call for the Singapore timeframe. I don't know if we'll get to it on the list ahead of time, but we think we can resolve everything and get a new one. So there'll be a new update of the draft in about end of August, I think we're targeting for that. And we should be able to progress it further, close enough to working group last call by Singapore.
So for the draft that comes up at the end of August, it would be really good to have some people who know that they're going to review that. And so I would like to ask, who has read any version of the PubSub document? Oh, quite a few people. Great. So who would be willing to review the next version that comes out in August? Jim already did the previous one. Hannes, Michelle, Carrie, Peter, Bill. That's a good set. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for doing this so quickly. So the next item is OSCOAP. It would be great if you would leave a couple of minutes at the end.
Thanks. Sorry. Okay, I start like this. Okay, so I'm going to talk about OSCOAP. This should have been Francesca standing here, but she has a cold and her voice almost lost her voice. So I'll try to be your voice, Francesca, and give your slides. And if I say something wrong, please yell, or maybe just wave. Okay, so the draft, last submitted version of the draft is version 4. Which was no major change from version 03, mainly including the use of the request tag, which is this option defined in the draft presented on Tuesday. And it's already using the repeat tag
which is also summarized in this new draft. So coming into this meeting, there were quite a few issues left on the issue tracker, but we spent a good deal of this meeting actually closing off a lot of these issues. So I think there are 4 issues left at the moment. And some of the issues mentioned here are closed. So we have simplified the observe option processing, and we have taken out OSCON from the document because that needs more thinking, and we think we should do that in a separate draft. We don't know where that would end up. There are some minor edits to the replay window. So it's a question of what kind of replay windows are being used, and whether there could be different replay windows on the different endpoints as they change roles. That's taken care of. Test vectors is still to be done, but we have results from the testing which we can use, and we discussed this morning exactly what type of test vectors we should have. So, and there is also another issue which we discussed this week, and which is on a separate slide, and it's looking at the end-to-end security from a co-op endpoint to an HTTP endpoint, and so there's a separate slide on that. So there's been a number of interop tests this year, 4 different tests. There are 6 implementations tested, 2 constrained C implementations, 1 in Contiki, 1 in OpenWSN, 2 in Python, 1 in Java, 1 in C#. And I learned at this meeting there are 2 more planned implementations, and one would be using Riot. So a lot of people, good thing here, a lot of people have implemented, read the same draft, and after a few bug fixes, they actually managed to interoperate and proceed through the test cases. We also benefited a lot during this meeting, sitting around the table, closing the issues with the discussion among the implementers, what's the best way to do this. So for example, the resolution of the observe option, which was a really simple solution, much simpler than we could have found out, was given by one of those, in one of those discussions. So in particular, Christian Amsus and Jim Schad has been very helpful here and are doing a really good, well, I mean, they're doing a large part of this work, actually. So we don't see any major issues. We think we will complete the remaining issues in the next update of the draft. And we'd like to hear if you have any views about what is missing in the draft, or any comments and questions.
Hey, Goran, Tim Carey, Nokia. So when we looked at the draft, we had a couple questions, and I don't know if you were addressing them in the draft. I don't think I've looked at it since maybe '02, right? There were some concerns that we had with, we were doing end-to-end security, and we were able to do object security all the way through, but we still had headers and that weren't integrity protected or confidential. So we had some privacy concerns. Are those issues addressed, or are they going to be addressed?
So I don't recall exactly. I recall a discussion. I don't recall exactly which headers we were discussing. There are, if you look at it, there's a table on which options are protected. Most are encrypted. Some are only integrity protected because of co-op proxy needs to read them. And so, I mean, what's in the draft today, I think, is what we think it needs to be protected.
So there was some that we were still, I guess, probably because it's going through a proxy, you don't have a choice then, but we had some privacy concerns with some of the integrity protected headers.
Yeah, maybe you could remind me offline or after the meeting.
Let me
exactly
I have to go back through it and look. I don't know.
Right, thank you.
Which raises the general question, once we have this update, again, we need reviewers, and I would be very happy if people would look very closely at the privacy considerations. Do we have a privacy consideration?
There is one section, yeah. But
maybe we want to make sure that
Sure.
we expand
No.
that.
It's a good comment. I'm sorry, I haven't looked at this in a while.
Both before and during this review. Do you have a plan when this next version will come out?
There is some vacation coming up, so I can't say exactly when, but we may be able to conclude during next week with some of these. So I mean, it's either next week or it's later, basically.
So in August.
I hear people want August, so let's aim for August.
Okay. So the question would be that version that comes up in August. Who would be willing to review that? Dave, Carrie, Michael, Tim.
Edgar?
Thank you, Edgar. Don't lean back when I'm asking questions like that. Okay, that's a few people. So who in this room cares about privacy? Yeah, so for instance, getting some more implementers, for instance, the right people to actually review that draft, send us a review of that draft, that would be really useful. Don't know if any of you can volunteer doing that. Well, maybe we catch you at the way out and don't let you leave before you agree. Okay.
Actually, I recall we didn't go through this slide.
Yes.
Would you want to take it, or should I?
I can do that.
Okay.
Thank you. So one thing that came up in a hallway discussion was that the current Appendix A, which will probably move into the body of the document in the next version, that defines the HTTP mapping as where we have a document defining the HTTP mapping for CoAP RFC 8075, and that document says any extension to CoAP is supposed to also define the HTTP mapping. So we had an appendix, and we'll have a section in the main document that defines that mapping. And we discussed about one point here, because there's a little bit of a change from 8075. 8075 assumed that the fact that CoAP response codes and HTTP response codes are similar but not entirely alike isn't really a big problem, because it can be mapped, best effort, and it will usually come out right. Now that's great until you add security, because for security you have to make sure that you get exactly the right value, otherwise you can't verify it. So the situation has changed a little bit, and the solution that Appendix A provides is adding an HTTP header field. This should say header field, not header, sorry about that, called something like CoAP code, which transports the CoAP code through HTTP segments on the way the request and response go end to end. So this is not really an OSCoAP thing. I mean, other users of HTTP CoAP cross proxies could use this. So it looks like the best way to handle this is to just make this a very short separate draft that defines that header field. We had a lovely lunch between the HTTP BIS chairs and the core chairs yesterday, so we have agreed that we want to really make sure we solve problems like this together. So this would be a short document we can give them and say, this is what we try to do. Are there any problems with that? So this is the proposal how to handle this. Any comments on that?
Coordination with HTTP BIS is good. Separate document, much better than putting into the same one, I agree. Potential comment to take into account in that other document is in the case where it is sort of exactly the same, meaning other than the period that's in there, and that was 201 goes to 201, maybe it's only necessary to put it in there when it's not sort of exactly equal to the same code number, right? And so that means you wouldn't need it in most cases, and you need it potentially only in the special cases you were alluding to. So that's something to take into account when writing that document, to say, you wouldn't necessarily expect this to be in every single packet, but it might be in a couple, error cases and so on, that would be necessary, so.
So we would exactly define the cases in which the value can be inferred.
Yeah, just so you can compress it out of the HTTP case because you don't actually need it. Yeah, it didn't.
Very good comment. Okay, with that, we are done with this point, and we actually did manage to end 5 minutes early, so we have a couple of minutes for the round.
Okay, thank you. So I'm very impressed because we talked about this morning, and I am in core just right now. To just explain you a problem, a feature we have with LP1 radio. So we have devices that can sleep, for example, 1 hour, send a message, sleep again, or they can sleep 1 day and then send a message. So if we want to secure the transmission with acknowledgement, then we have longer time than what has been defined in CoAP right now. For the server has to maintain a list of message ID for a certain period of time. So here we may have a big diversity of clients, some clients that can be very reactive, some clients that can sleep a lot of time. So we have to say to the server, keep this number longer than the usual things. So that's why we propose to add an option in CoAP that say, for example, a time square. On this time square, say this client sleep all the time for 1 day and can receive only an acknowledgement after this day. So I don't know if I was very clear, but in fact, it's to maintain the message ID for a long period of time into the server.
Because the retransmission might only come after an hour.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, because the device sleep and.
So Tim Karinoka, so the inference here is as a server, right? Because you're asking me to keep it, right? Is that on a per client basis, I have to keep some state information about the client while we're talking?
You have to keep it longer, yes.
But that's the case right now. But you keep it for 5 minutes, and if you lose this state after 5 minutes and you get a retransmission, then you will process again the packet, and that's the problem.
And you want me to just sort of hold off for an hour until you wake back up as a client,
Yeah.
right? So that can get pretty complex when you're talking about multiple networks and stuff like that. So we just got to be careful. I think it's more than just a timer, right? Because how I communicate with that client can be across differing networks, right? But we're talking about the end client point that's sleeping. And we're not talking about how it can progress through a network. I'm just sorting through it, right? So it's probably, it's probably just a single set of things that you have to know in order to talk to that thing. But you still got, what do you do with the information you want to give, right? That's the thing. You got to queue all that stuff up and keep it. That could be a bit problematic when you start talking about, what's fresh, what's stale. Something to consider.
Yeah, so it's clear that this requires a little bit of thinking. Those who have been here for a long time will remember an option called patience that we discussed here, and then at some point decided we didn't need it, and this may be resurrecting the patience option. So maybe you want to look for an old draft called CoAP MISC that defined that patience option. But yes, there are lots of considerations that have to be made when you start warping the timescales in an implementation. And we probably have to go through this as a co-working group and see where do we see the leverage for this option, and where maybe nothing changes. So this is mostly a heads up for that work needing to be done. Eric?
Yeah, Eric Nordmark. So the example you gave, it sounded like there's only one message, right? So the number of message, whatever IDs you have to track is one per client. But does this come with a limit on that as well, so that you don't have to store 1,000 of these things because someone set it to 24 hours, but we're sending a lot more, right?
Yes,
if you can limit that, it might be less of an
that's a good
impact.
idea. Yeah, generally we try to avoid giving someone else a handle on the amount of resources that I need to keep up. So that is certainly a consideration. On the other hand, a node that is prepared to talk to a millibit network node that has to take some special measures. So who would be interested to work with Laurent on defining this option? I'm seeing a hand, but Alex. Yeah, Alex. Any other CoAP experts that want to step in? Matthias is only slightly shaking his head. I take this. Yeah. So at least we will implicate Matthias. Okay. Thank you. We just reached the end of the meeting. Thank you all. See you all in Singapore. Yeah, it's not even in a state that we can discuss that. I'm not a student. Different I also like to write the I will try to write mine up. I understand that. Okay, no problem.
Existing it says if this is specifically for any source mode, I guess. But if you actually have a pure list of that, one node is not set, and everybody else